Emily Lawson stood at the entrance of Mercy Hills General Hospital, her hands clasped tightly around the strap of her bag. The building loomed before her, a modern structure of glass and steel, gleaming under the harsh morning sun. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a prestigious hospital in the heart of the city, a place known for its medical excellence and state-of-the-art facilities. But standing there, with the sterile scent of disinfectant in the air and the bustle of the hospital already humming behind the automatic doors, Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been a nurse for years, worked in some of the toughest places, but this was different. Mercy Hills had a reputation. Its pristine facade masked the whispers she had heard before she even applied. Rumors of deep-seated biases, of subtle and not-so-subtle exclusions. But Emily had ignored the warnings. She was determined to prove herself, to rise above whatever challenges awaited her. With a deep breath, she pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The inside of the hospital was as sleek and polished as its exterior. The lobby was wide, with white marble floors that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, clipboards in hand, speaking in low voices. Everything seemed orderly, efficient, perfect even. But Emily knew better than to trust appearances. As she approached the nurse's station, the feeling of being watched crept over her. She could feel eyes on her, subtle glances from the staff who were going about their business. Conversations dropped to a hush as she walked past, and the tension that had been bubbling under the surface since she arrived began to churn more intensely. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. "I'm Emily Lawson, the new nurse. Can someone direct me to the head nurse's office?" One of the nurses, a tall blonde woman named Kelly Thompson, glanced up from her clipboard. Her blue eyes widened slightly, then narrowed as a polite but distant smile crossed her face. "Head Nurse Wallace's office is down the hall, third door on the right." "Thank you," Emily said, returning the smile, though it felt forced. As she made her way down the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that every step was being scrutinized. The sound of her sensible shoes tapping against the marble floor felt too loud, too sharp, in the unnaturally quiet hallway. She had dealt with this before, the subtle stares, the whispered comments, but somehow this felt different, deeper, more insidious. When she reached the head nurse's office, Emily knocked and waited for the stern voice from within. "Come in." She stepped inside to find Joan Wallace, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, seated behind a large wooden desk. Wallace had the look of someone who had seen it all and had no time for pleasantries. Her sharp eyes flicked up to meet Emily's, and for a moment there was a pause, a moment of recognition, as if Wallace was sizing her up, deciding where she fit. "Nurse Lawson, I presume?" Wallace said, her voice clipped. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here for my first day," Emily replied, keeping her tone professional. "Good," Wallace said, standing up. "We'll get you settled in. You'll be assigned to the surgical recovery wing for now. It's a busy department, and I expect you to keep up." "I'm ready," Emily said firmly, though the weight of Wallace's expectations was already settling heavily on her shoulders. As Wallace handed her the assignment for the day, Emily couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a new job. The air in the hospital felt charged, like there was something brewing beneath the surface, something she couldn't yet see. But whatever it was, she was determined not to let it overwhelm her. The first few hours of her shift were a whirlwind of activity. The surgical recovery wing was chaotic, filled with patients coming out of anesthesia, their families waiting anxiously in the hallway. Emily worked quickly, moving from one patient to the next, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, and making sure everything was in order. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her again, the nurses, the doctors, all watching her, waiting for her to slip up. But she kept her head down, focused on the task at hand. It wasn't until her break that she finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She found a quiet corner in the staff lounge and sank into a chair, letting out a long breath. But the moment of peace didn't last. As she sipped her coffee, two nurses entered the lounge, their voices low but clear enough for Emily to hear. "Did you see the new hire?" one of them whispered. Her tone tinged with something Emily knew all too well, disdain. "Yeah," the other replied. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the neighborhood for, well, you know." Emily's grip tightened around her coffee cup. She had heard comments like this before, thinly veiled and hidden behind false politeness, but each time they cut deeper. She set her cup down and stood, forcing herself to walk calmly past the nurses. Their conversation stopped abruptly as she passed, and she could feel their eyes following her as she left the room. The familiar weight of isolation settled over her shoulders, but she pushed it aside. She had dealt with this before. She could handle it. She had no other choice. By the time her shift ended, Emily was exhausted both physically and emotionally. As she gathered her things from her locker, she overheard more hushed conversations, this time about her performance. The tone was always the same, doubtful, questioning. No one had said anything to her directly, but she could feel the judgment in every sideways glance, every polite smile that didn't reach their eyes. As she left the hospital, the cold evening air hit her like a wave, and for a moment she felt a pang of regret. Maybe she had made a mistake coming here. Maybe the rumors had been right. But then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her mother. "You're stronger than this place. Don't let them make you doubt it. Love you." Emily smiled, her heart lifting slightly. Her mother had always been her biggest supporter, the one who had pushed her to keep going, even when things got hard. And right now, she needed that reminder more than ever. As she walked to the bus stop, her mind drifted back to the hospital. The stairs, the whispers, the tension that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about surviving in a place that didn't want her there, a place that was determined to push her out. But Emily wasn't going to let them win. She had come too far, worked too hard to back down now. When she reached the bus stop, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and for a moment, Emily thought it was just a passerby. But then she caught a glimpse of the man behind the wheel, Dr. William Greaves, one of the hospital's most senior doctors, and the one person she had been hoping to avoid. "Waiting for the bus?" Dr. Greaves asked, his voice smooth, but laced with something Emily couldn't quite place. "A shame, but I suppose that's what a nurse's salary will get you." Emily's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm fine, doctor, thank you." Dr. Greaves chuckled, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he drove away, leaving Emily standing alone at the bus stop, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and frustration. She watched the car disappear into the distance, the cold air biting at her skin. She wasn't sure what Dr. Greaves had meant by that comment, but she knew it wasn't a compliment. And if his attitude was any indication of what she would be facing in the coming days, then things were about to get a lot harder. But as the bus pulled up and Emily stepped inside, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just a job. This was her proving ground. And she wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how powerful, make her feel like she didn't belong. As the bus rumbled down the darkened streets, Emily closed her eyes, drawing strength from her mother's words. She had overcome challenges before, and she would do it again. Little did she know, her presence at Mercy Hills was about to set off a chain of events that would change everything, exposing the deep-rooted prejudices within the hospital's walls and forcing her to make choices she had never imagined. The following day at Mercy Hills General, Emily arrived early, hoping to get a head start on her shift. The hospital was quiet in the early morning, with only a few nurses milling about and the faint sound of machines beeping from patient rooms. She had always preferred the calm before the storm, those few moments of peace before the day fully kicked into gear. But even in the quiet, there was an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't shake. Yesterday's encounters, the whispered comments, the cold stares, and Dr. Greaves' veiled insult, still lingered in her mind. It was like a shadow following her, reminding her that she was being watched, scrutinized for the smallest mistake. As she made her way to the surgical recovery wing, her assigned department, she mentally prepared herself for another long day. She knew she would have to be perfect. No room for errors, no space for hesitation. Not in this place. But before she even reached her station, a familiar figure stepped into her path. "Nurse Lawson," came the voice of Dr. William Greaves, the same doctor who had driven past her in his sleek black car the night before. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and he wore his white coat with an air of authority that left no doubt about his position in the hospital hierarchy. Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral as she approached him. "Good morning, Dr. Greaves." He glanced at her with that same unreadable expression she had seen the day before. "I trust you've familiarized yourself with the protocols of this department." "I have, Doctor," Emily said, her voice steady. Dr. Greaves didn't respond immediately, but his gaze lingered on her a second too long, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Good. I hope you're prepared to meet our high standards." "I'll do my best," she replied, refusing to let the subtle condescension in his tone affect her. "I expect nothing less," he said coolly before turning on his heel and walking away, leaving Emily standing there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It was subtle, so subtle that someone else might not have noticed. But Emily felt it keenly. The way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, as if he was waiting for her to fail. She had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. It was the quiet racism, the kind that was hard to point out directly, but impossible to ignore. And it was clear that Dr. Greaves was one of the worst offenders. Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to let people like Dr. Greaves get under her skin, not if she wanted to succeed here. The morning passed in a blur of patient rounds, checking vitals, and managing post-surgical care. The surgical recovery wing was busy as usual, with patients coming in and out of anesthesia, their families anxiously waiting for updates. Emily moved quickly and efficiently, doing her best to keep up with the demands of the day. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. Kelly Thompson, the blonde nurse who had greeted her so coldly on her first day, was working the same shift. Emily noticed that every time she approached a patient, Kelly would find an excuse to hover nearby, her eyes scanning over Emily's work with an almost predatory focus. It wasn't long before Kelly found an opportunity to pounce. "Nurse Lawson," Kelly said in a voice that was too loud, drawing the attention of several nearby nurses. She was holding a patient's chart, her brow furrowed as if she had discovered a grave error. "Did you forget to update Mr. Harrow's medication schedule? It seems like an oversight." Emily's stomach dropped. She knew she hadn't made a mistake. She had double-checked everything before moving on. But the implication was clear. Kelly was trying to catch her out, to prove that she didn't belong. "I didn't forget," Emily replied calmly, stepping over to Kelly and looking at the chart. "I updated it earlier, but the system can sometimes lag. You can refresh it." Kelly's lips twitched, clearly dissatisfied with Emily's answer. She opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, Dr. Patel, one of the surgeons, approached the nurse's station. "Nurse Lawson," Dr. Patel said, his expression serious but not unkind. "Can you assist with post-op care for Mr. Gomez in room 204? He's having some complications, and I could use your help." Relieved for the distraction, Emily nodded. "Of course, doctor, I'll head there now." As she walked away, she could feel Kelly's eyes burning into her back, but she refused to let it rattle her. Kelly had made her intentions clear from the start. She was looking for any reason to undermine Emily. But Emily had no intention of giving her the satisfaction. Mr. Gomez was an elderly patient who had undergone a complex heart surgery the day before. When Emily entered the room, she found him in visible discomfort, his breathing labored as the machines around him beeped in warning. Dr. Patel was already there, adjusting the settings on the monitor. "His vitals have been unstable since early this morning," he explained, his tone calm but focused. "I need you to help with his oxygen levels while I get his medication ready." Emily immediately moved to assist, adjusting the flow of oxygen and checking the IV. Mr. Gomez's condition was delicate, but years of experience had trained Emily to stay calm in these moments. She focused on the task at hand, ignoring the nagging voice in the back of her mind that reminded her of the extra pressure she was under. Dr. Patel was relying on her, and she wouldn't let him down. As they worked, Mr. Gomez's condition slowly stabilized. His breathing evened out, and the tension in the room began to ease. "Good work, Nurse Lawson," Dr. Patel said, glancing at her with a small nod of approval. "You handled that well." "Thank you, Doctor," Emily replied, feeling a flicker of pride. But the relief was short-lived. As they left the room, Dr. Greaves appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression cold as he approached them. Emily braced herself for whatever was coming next. "Dr. Patel," Greaves said, his voice tight, "I've been hearing some concerns about Nurse Lawson's performance." Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she fought to keep her face neutral. She knew exactly where this was coming from. Kelly. The rumors. The whispers. It was all coming together now. Dr. Patel frowned, glancing at Emily before turning back to Greaves. "Concerns? I just worked with Nurse Lawson on a post-op case, and she handled it efficiently. I have no complaints." Greaves's eyes flicked over to Emily, his expression unreadable. "I see. Well, we'll be keeping a close eye on things. Mercy Hills has high standards, as I'm sure you're aware." Dr. Patel nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Of course, but I have no reason to believe that Nurse Lawson is anything less than capable." Emily felt a surge of gratitude for Dr. Patel's support, but it was clear that Greaves wasn't satisfied. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he finally turned and walked away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Dr. Patel sighed, glancing at Emily. "Don't let him get to you. He has a way of testing people." Emily nodded, though the tightness in her chest remained. "I won't." But even as she said it, she knew that Greaves's words would stay with her long after the shift ended. She could feel the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on her, the pressure to be perfect, to prove herself over and over again. And the worst part was, she knew that no matter how hard she worked, it wouldn't be enough for people like Greaves. By the time her shift ended, Emily was mentally and physically drained. As she walked to the bus stop, her mind raced with everything that had happened that day. The constant pressure, the whispered doubts, and Dr. Greaves's thinly veiled threat. She had done everything right, but it didn't seem to matter. They were still waiting for her to fail. When she arrived at the bus stop, the same sleek black car from the night before pulled up beside her. Dr. Greaves. Again. The window rolled down, and he looked at her with that same infuriating smile. "Rough day, Nurse Lawson?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. Emily's heart pounded with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Just another day at work, Doctor." Greaves's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I hope you're not letting the pressure get to you. We expect our staff to perform at their best, after all." Emily clenched her fists at her sides, but she didn't respond. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. After a moment, Greaves shrugged and rolled up the window, driving off into the night. As the car disappeared from view, Emily took a deep breath, her chest tightening with frustration. It was clear now, Greaves was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. And Kelly, with her petty grievances, was feeding him the ammunition he needed. But despite everything, Emily knew she couldn't let them win. She had worked too hard, come too far, to be pushed out by people like Greaves and Kelly. She had earned her place at Mercy Hills, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. As the bus pulled up and she stepped inside, Emily felt a spark of determination ignite in her chest. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about standing up for herself, for her patients, and for every other nurse who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The storm was coming, and Emily knew she would have to weather it, but she wasn't backing down, not this time. The days at Mercy Hills passed in a blur of grueling shifts and quiet battles. Emily had settled into the rhythm of the hospital, but the pressure never let up. Every day, she felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of her job with the constant scrutiny of people like Dr. William Greaves and Kelly Thompson. They weren't the only ones. There were others, too, who watched her with the same cold, calculated stares, waiting for her to make a mistake. But what unnerved her most was the growing realization that the hospital's problems went much deeper than she had initially thought. The racism and bias she experienced weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger, more insidious system. One afternoon, as she was completing her rounds in the surgical recovery wing, Emily overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. Dr. Patel and another surgeon, Dr. Ross, were speaking in low voices just outside a patient's room. Emily paused just out of sight, listening as their words drifted through the partially closed door. "I don't know how long we can keep this quiet," Dr. Patel was saying, his voice tense. The administration is covering things up, but the patients are starting to notice. This could blow up in our faces. Dr. Ross sighed heavily. What do you want me to do, Raj? I've been telling them for months that we need to address these issues, but they won't listen. They're too worried about their precious reputation. Emily's heart raced as she listened. She wasn't sure what they were talking about, but it was clear that something was very wrong. The administration, the same people who ran the hospital with such strict precision, who demanded perfection from their staff, were hiding something. And whatever it wasn't good. Just keep your head down, Dr. Patel said, his voice lowering even more. For now, we do what we're told, but if this comes out... The rest of his sentence was lost as the door creaked open. Emily quickly stepped back, pretending to review a patient's chart as Dr. Patel and Dr. Ross emerged from the room. Both men looked tense, their conversation ending abruptly when they saw her. Nurse Lawson, Dr. Patel said, his tone neutral, but his eyes flicking toward her with the slightest hint of suspicion. Doctor, Emily replied, keeping her expression calm. I was just checking on Mrs. Reyes. Her vitals are stable, and she's recovering well. Dr. Patel nodded, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. Good. Keep me updated if anything changes. As the two doctors walked away, Emily's mind spun with questions. What were they hiding? And why was the administration so desperate to keep it quiet? She had known from the start that Mercy Hills wasn't as perfect as it seemed, but this was something else, something deeper. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Kelly Thompson's voice, sharp and condescending as always. Nurse Lawson, Kelly said as she approached the nurse's station, holding a clipboard in one hand and an unmistakable smirk on her face. I hope you're keeping up with your patients. You wouldn't want to fall behind. Emily looked up, her patience wearing thin. Everything is under control, Kelly? Kelly's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly dissatisfied with Emily's calm response. Good, because I heard you had some issues with Mr. Harrow's chart yesterday. You should be more careful. Errors like that could cause problems. Emily clenched her teeth. She knew Kelly was trying to undermine her, but she wasn't going to let her get away with it. There were no errors. I double-checked everything. Kelly's smirk faltered, just for a moment, but she recovered quickly. We'll see. Just remember, this place has high standards, and not everyone can meet them. With that, Kelly turned and walked away, leaving Emily fuming. It was the same every day. Small, calculated attacks designed to make her doubt herself, to make her feel like she didn't belong. And now, with Dr. Greaves backing Kelly up, the pressure was even greater. But Emily wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. She had worked too hard to get here, and she wasn't going to let them push her out. Later that evening, after her shift had ended, Emily sat in the nearly empty staff lounge, sipping a cup of coffee and trying to clear her mind. The conversation she had overheard between Dr. Patel and Dr. Ross still nagged at her, but she didn't know what to do with the information. She was just a nurse. What could she possibly do about the problems within the administration? As she sat there, lost in thought, a voice pulled her from her reverie. You look like you've had a long day. Emily looked up to see Michael Archer standing in the doorway. He had been transferred out of the surgical recovery wing a few days ago, but his presence at the hospital remained a mystery. He wasn't just any patient. He was important, influential, and his quiet observation of everything around him hadn't gone unnoticed. Mr. Archer, Emily said, setting her coffee down. I didn't expect to see you here. Archer smiled faintly as he walked over to join her at the table. I didn't expect to be here this long, but life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something about Michael Archer that set him apart from everyone else at Mercy Hills. He saw things, noticed things, that others didn't. And as much as Emily tried to stay focused on her work, she couldn't help but feel drawn into whatever he was observing. You seem like someone who notices a lot, Archer said after a moment, his tone casual but probing. How's the hospital treating you? Emily hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to reveal. She had learned early on not to trust people too easily, especially in a place like this. But there was something about Archer's calm demeanor that made her feel like she could speak freely. It's challenging, she admitted, her voice quiet. There are people here who don't think I belong. Archer nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's not surprising. Hospitals like this have a way of making people feel like outsiders, even when they're doing everything right. Emily looked at him, surprised by how accurately he had captured what she was feeling. You've noticed that? Archer smiled again, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. I notice a lot of things, and I've noticed that you're not like the others. You actually care. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had spent her entire career trying to prove that she was more than capable, that she was worthy of her position. And yet, here was a man who had seen through all of that in just a few short days. I try, she said softly, but it feels like it's never enough. Archer leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. That's because this place isn't designed to reward people like you. It's built to protect the ones who hold the power, the ones who make the rules. And those people aren't interested in change. They're interested in maintaining control. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Archer's words hit far too close to home. She had known for a while now that Mercy Hills wasn't what it appeared to be, but hearing it laid out so clearly made it all the more real. What are you saying? She asked quietly. I'm saying that if you want things to change, you can't just play by their rules, Archer said, his voice low but firm. You have to be willing to stand up even when it's hard, and you can't do it alone. Emily's mind raced. She had spent so much of her time at Mercy Hills trying to keep her head down, trying to avoid conflict. But now, she was starting to realize that conflict was unavoidable. People like Dr. Greaves and Kelly Thompson were never going to accept her, no matter how hard she worked. And the administration? They were hiding something that could potentially put patients at risk. You think I should speak up? Emily asked, her heart pounding. I think you need to decide what kind of person you want to be, Archer replied, his gaze intense. You can stay quiet, keep your head down, and let them push you around, or you can stand up for what you know is right. But whatever you choose, just know that people are watching. And some of them are on your side, even if it doesn't feel that way right now. Emily stared at him, her mind swirling with thoughts. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she had been struggling with the question of whether to stay silent or fight back. But now, with Archer sitting across from her, it felt like she was at a crossroads. She had always believed in doing her job to the best of her ability, in caring for her patients and letting her work speak for itself. But was that enough? Was it enough to just survive in a system that was broken, or did she need to do more? Before she could answer, the door to the lounge opened, and Joan Wallace, the head nurse, stepped inside. Nurse Lawson, Wallace said, her tone brisk. I need to speak with you. Emily stood, her heart racing. Yes, ma'am? As she followed Wallace out of the lounge, she glanced back at Archer, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. His words echoed in her mind as she walked down the hallway, unsure of what was waiting for her in Wallace's office. The cracks in the system were growing wider, and Emily knew that soon something would have to give. The head nurse's office was as cold and impersonal as Emily remembered from her first day. Joan Wallace sat behind her desk, her sharp eyes fixed on Emily as she gestured for her to take a seat. I've been hearing some concerning reports, Wallace began, her voice as stern as ever. There are whispers that you've been struggling to keep up with the workload. Emily's heart sank. She knew exactly where this was coming from, Kelly's constant efforts to undermine her, Dr. Greaves's scrutiny. But the truth was, she had been working harder than ever, doing everything she could to meet the demands of her job. With all due respect, I've been doing my best, Emily said, keeping her tone measured. I'm confident in the care I've provided. Wallace's eyes narrowed slightly. Be that as it may, this is a competitive environment. Mercy Hills has high standards, and we expect all of our staff to meet them. I need to know that you're up for the challenge. Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. This wasn't just about her performance. It was about who she was, where she came from. She was being tested, pushed to prove that she deserved to be here. And no matter how hard she worked, she knew that for people like Wallace, Dr. Greaves, and Kelly, she would always have to work twice as hard. I am up for the challenge, Emily said firmly, meeting Wallace's gaze head-on. I'm here to do my job, and I'm committed to providing the best care for my patients." Wallace studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, though there was no warmth in the gesture. "Very well," she said. "I'll be keeping a close eye on you, Nurse Lawson. Don't give me a reason to doubt your abilities." "I won't," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. As she left the office, Emily felt a mix of frustration and determination. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that the higher-ups were waiting for her to stumble. But as much as they tried to push her out, she wasn't going to back down. She had a decision to make, whether to keep her head down and survive, or to stand up and fight for something better. And with Michael Archer's words echoing in her mind, she knew that she couldn't stay silent any longer. The next morning, the weight of Emily's decision weighed heavily on her as she entered Mercy Hills General. The familiar routine of checking her patient charts, moving through the surgical recovery wing, and exchanging polite nods with her colleagues felt hollow. Beneath the surface of the hospital's sterile efficiency, she could sense the cracks widening. Every interaction, every passing glance, seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. As she moved through her rounds, Emily kept replaying the conversation she had overheard between Dr. Patel and Dr. Ross. The administration was hiding something serious, and yet she felt powerless to do anything about it. She was just a nurse, a black nurse, no less. Someone whose presence in a place like Mercy Hills was already under scrutiny. But then there were Michael Archer's words from the night before, his calm assurance that she wasn't alone. That change was possible, but it wouldn't come from silence. It would come from speaking up, from taking a stand. He had seen something in her that she hadn't been willing to see in herself. Strength. Determination. Emily wasn't sure if she believed it yet, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep quiet any longer. The system wasn't just flawed, it was broken, and if she stayed silent, she would become complicit in its failures. The day dragged on, but the unease in the hospital only grew. The whispers that had followed her since her first day seemed louder now, more pointed. She could feel the eyes on her as she worked, the quiet judgments from her colleagues, especially from Kelly Thompson. By mid-afternoon, Emily was assisting with a post-op patient in the surgical wing when Kelly approached her with the same cold, scrutinizing look she had worn since the day Emily arrived. "Nurse Lawson," Kelly said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you might want to check your charts again. It seems like there's been a discrepancy with Mr. Gomez's medication schedule." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression calm. She had double-checked everything before administering the medication, as always. But this was becoming Kelly's favorite game, finding small, insignificant issues and blowing them out of proportion to make Emily look incompetent. "There's no discrepancy," Emily replied firmly, standing her ground. "I've checked the schedule twice and everything is correct." Kelly's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe you should check it a third time. We wouldn't want any mistakes, would we?" Emily clenched her fists at her sides, resisting the urge to snap back. Kelly was baiting her, trying to get a reaction, but she wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. "Not today. I've already spoken to Dr. Patel," Emily said, keeping her voice steady. "He's satisfied with the care I've provided." Kelly's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Well, Dr. Patel isn't the only one you need to impress. There are other people in this hospital who are watching. Don't forget that." Emily's blood boiled as Kelly turned and walked away, her words hanging in the air like a threat. There was no point in engaging with her. Kelly was playing a different game, one Emily had no interest in winning. But as she watched Kelly disappear down the hall, Emily realized something. Kelly wasn't just undermining her because she was new or because she was different. Kelly was part of the system that was designed to protect people like her. People who thrived in an environment that prioritized privilege and power over skill and compassion. And Kelly, for all her cruelty, was just a symptom of a much larger problem. Emily's chest tightened with anger, but beneath the anger, there was something else. Determination. Archer had told her that people were watching, and he was right. But it wasn't just people like Kelly or Dr. Greaves. There were others, too. People who wanted to see things change, who were waiting for someone to take the first step. Emily knew she had to be that person. Later that evening, after her shift had ended, Emily found herself once again in the hospital's staff lounge. The room was quiet, most of the other nurses having already left for the day, but the weight of the day's events still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She sat at one of the small round tables, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that the tension that had been building since her arrival at Mercy Hills was about to break. As she stared into her coffee, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke through the silence. "You're thinking too hard again." Emily looked up to see Michael Archer standing in the doorway, his expression as calm and knowing as ever. He walked over and sat down across from her, folding his hands on the table. "Rough day?" he asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You could say that." Archer leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" Emily frowned. "See what?" "The cracks in the system," Archer said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "This place isn't what it seems. It's built to protect the people at the top, the ones who make the rules, and they'll do anything to keep that power." Emily nodded, her mind flashing back to Dr. Greaves, to Kelly, to the conversation she had overheard between Dr. Patel and Dr. Ross. "I've noticed." Archer smiled faintly. "And what are you going to do about it?" Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. "I don't know. I want to do something. I just don't know where to start." Archer's smile widened, but it was a smile tinged with something darker, something more dangerous. "You start by speaking the truth. People are afraid to speak up because they think they'll lose everything if they do. But the truth has a way of unraveling things. All it takes is one person willing to stand up." Emily swallowed hard. She had never been one to shy away from difficult situations, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her, it was about the entire system at Mercy Hills. It was about the way the hospital treated its staff, its patients, and the way people like her were pushed to the margins. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Archer's gaze softened. "You are. You just don't know it yet." Emily looked down at her hands, her mind racing. Could she really do this? Could she really be the one to speak out, to challenge the system that had been in place for so long? It seemed impossible, but then she thought about the patients she cared for, the ones who trusted her, who relied on her to advocate for them when no one else would. She thought about the other nurses, the ones who had been silenced or pushed out because they didn't fit the mold. And she thought about herself, about the years she had spent working twice as hard to prove herself in a world that didn't want her to succeed. Maybe Archer was right. Maybe she was strong enough. "I'm scared," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Archer reached across the table, his hand resting on hers for just a moment. "Everyone's scared, but fear isn't a reason to stay silent." Emily looked up at him, and for the first time, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope." "Thank you," she whispered. Archer nodded, his expression serious. "You're not alone, Emily. Remember that." The next morning, Emily arrived at Mercy Hills with a new sense of purpose. The fear and doubt that had clouded her mind the night before hadn't disappeared, but they had been tempered by something stronger. She had spent too long trying to survive in a system that was designed to exclude her, to push her out. But now, she was ready to fight back. As she moved through the surgical recovery wing, Emily noticed that the tension in the air was even thicker than usual. The nurses were quieter, the doctors more tense. Something was happening, and it wasn't just her imagination. By mid-morning, the source of that tension became clear. Emily was checking on a patient's vitals when she heard raised voices coming from down the hall. She couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was unmistakable, an argument. She quickly finished her work and made her way toward the commotion, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded the corner, she saw a group of nurses gathered outside one of the patient rooms, their faces a mix of shock and fear. In the middle of the group stood Dr. Greaves, his face red with anger as he berated one of the younger nurses. "What do you mean? You didn't follow the protocol?" Dr. Greaves snapped, his voice sharp. "This is unacceptable. Do you realize the risk you've put this patient in?" The young nurse, Anna, Emily remembered her name, looked close to tears as she tried to explain herself. I'm sorry, doctor. I thought I had followed the correct procedure. But, you thought? Greaves interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. You don't get paid to think, you get paid to follow orders, and clearly you're not capable of doing that. Emily's blood boiled as she watched the scene unfold. This was what Mercy Hills had become, a place where nurses were berated and belittled for the smallest mistakes, where doctors like Greaves held all the power and wielded it like a weapon. She couldn't stay silent anymore. "Dr. Greaves?" Emily said, stepping forward. Her voice was calm but firm, and the crowd of nurses parted as she approached. Greaves turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "This doesn't concern you, Nurse Lawson." "It does concern me," Emily replied, her heart pounding. "Because Anna followed the protocol to the letter. The issue wasn't with her, it was with the faulty equipment that we've been reporting for weeks, and nothing has been done about it." The crowd of nurses gasped, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Dr. Greaves stared at Emily, his face a mask of fury, but she didn't back down. "I'm not going to stand by and let you blame your mistakes on the staff," Emily continued, her voice steady. "The administration has ignored our concerns for too long, and it's time someone spoke up." Greaves's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and for a moment, Emily thought he might explode. But instead, he took a deep breath and lowered his voice, his eyes cold. "You've just made a very big mistake, Nurse Lawson," he said quietly. Emily held his gaze, refusing to back down. "Maybe, but I'm done staying silent." The air in Mercy Hills General Hospital felt different the morning after Emily had confronted Dr. William Greaves in front of the other nurses. As she walked through the familiar corridors, the usual rhythm of the hospital, footsteps echoing against the gleaming floors, the soft murmur of conversations, seemed almost muted. Emily could feel the weight of eyes on her from every direction. She had done the unthinkable, challenged one of the most powerful men in the hospital, and not in private, but in front of everyone. The whispers had started before her shift even began. She really stood up to Greaves? Does she know what she's done? She's brave, but is it worth the risk? Emily had heard them all, the hushed conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. But she didn't care. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. As she approached the nurses' station, the usual flurry of activity slowed, and several nurses, including Kelly Thompson, glanced up at her. The atmosphere was tense, as though everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Emily kept her head high, refusing to let their stares affect her. "Morning, Lawson," Kelly said, her voice unusually neutral. Gone was the smugness that usually accompanied her greetings. Kelly looked uncertain now, as though she wasn't sure whether to mock Emily or stay quiet. Emily simply nodded in response and checked her patient list for the day. As she scanned the chart, she felt someone approach her from behind. "I heard about what happened yesterday," came a familiar voice. Emily turned to see Anna, the young nurse who had been the target of Dr. Greaves's outburst the day before. She looked nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was listening before lowering her voice. "Thank you for standing up for me." Emily smiled softly. "You didn't deserve what happened, Anna. It wasn't your fault." Anna's eyes widened with gratitude, but there was also fear in them. "I know, but Greaves doesn't forget things like that. He's going to make your life miserable now. You know that, right?" Emily nodded, her stomach tightening with the reality of Anna's words. She had known the moment she spoke up that there would be consequences, but hearing it confirmed made it feel all the more real. Still, she couldn't regret what she had done. Standing by and watching Greaves bully people, blaming others for the hospital's problems, wasn't an option anymore. "I'll deal with whatever comes," Emily said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. But someone had to speak up. Anna smiled weakly, but there was still worry in her eyes. "Be careful, okay? He's got connections. He could get you fired." Emily didn't respond, though the thought weighed heavily on her mind. She had worked too hard to get here, and the idea of being pushed out because she had stood up for what was right felt unfair. But at the same time, she couldn't back down. Not now. As Anna walked away, Emily returned to her work, trying to focus on her patients. But the unease that had settled over the hospital after her confrontation with Dr. Greaves lingered in every corner, growing stronger with each passing hour. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tense interactions and silent judgment. The patients were her only solace, each one grateful for her attention and care, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. But even as Emily worked through her rounds, the anxiety of what might come next hung over her like a dark cloud. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, when her shift was nearing its end, that the inevitable confrontation came. Emily was finishing up with a patient when her pager buzzed. A message from Joan Wallace, the head nurse, asking her to come to her office immediately. Emily's heart sank. She knew this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. With a steadying breath, she made her way to Wallace's office. As she approached the door, she could hear the faint hum of voices inside. For a moment, she hesitated. What was waiting for her on the other side? But she pushed the thought away and knocked. "Come in," Wallace's voice called from within. Emily opened the door to find Joan Wallace seated behind her desk, her expression as stern as ever. But what made Emily's pulse quicken was the presence of Dr. Greaves, standing by the window with his arms crossed, his face unreadable but his eyes cold. "Have a seat, Nurse Lawson," Wallace said, her tone clipped. Emily sat, her heart pounding but her face composed. She wasn't going to show fear, no matter what they threw at her. "I've been hearing some disturbing reports," Wallace began, glancing between Emily and Greaves, "about yesterday's incident in the surgical recovery wing." Emily's throat tightened, but she met Wallace's gaze head-on. "I spoke up because the situation was being mishandled, ma'am. Nurse Anna followed protocol, and Dr. Greaves was blaming her for something that wasn't her fault. The faulty equipment should have been addressed weeks ago." Dr. Greaves's eyes flashed with anger, but he remained silent, letting Wallace handle the situation. Wallace sighed, her fingers tapping against her desk. "Nurse Lawson, I appreciate your concern, but this is a delicate matter. Dr. Greaves is a senior member of our staff, and there are ways to handle disagreements that don't involve public confrontations." "Public confrontations?" Emily repeated, incredulous. "I wasn't trying to start a scene. I was trying to protect my colleague and hold the administration accountable for ignoring ongoing issues with patient safety." "Your colleague didn't need your protection," Greaves said coldly, finally speaking up. His voice was low, but each word was laced with menace. "What you did yesterday was out of line, and if you think you're going to make a name for yourself here by challenging me, you're sorely mistaken." Emily's heart raced, but she refused to let her voice waver. "I'm not trying to make a name for myself. I'm just doing my job, and my job is to advocate for my patients and my colleagues when I see something wrong." The tension in the room was palpable, but Wallace quickly intervened before things could escalate further. "Enough. This isn't the place for personal disputes." She turned her gaze to Emily. "Nurse Lawson, I understand that you're new here and that you're trying to make an impression, but this hospital has a chain of command. If you have concerns, you bring them to your supervisor. You don't cause disruptions in front of the staff." Emily bit back the retort that was on the tip of her tongue. She could see where this was going. They were trying to make it seem like she had overstepped, like she had been unprofessional for daring to stand up to someone like Greaves. It didn't matter that she was right. What mattered was maintaining the hierarchy. "I'll keep that in mind," Emily said, forcing herself to stay calm. Wallace's expression softened just slightly. "Good. I expect you to be more mindful in the future." But before Emily could respond, Dr. Greaves spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't over, Lawson. You've made your choice, and now you'll have to live with it." Wallace shot him a warning glance, but it was clear that Greaves had said exactly what he wanted to say. Emily's stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear, but she refused to let him see how much his words rattled her. "I'll continue doing my job," Emily said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "That's all I've ever done." Without another word, she stood and left the office, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked down the hallway. She had known there would be consequences for standing up to Greaves, but now that they were starting to unfold, the weight of it hit her full force. What had she done? Had she just made herself a target? The evening was quiet, but the tension didn't fade when Emily finally returned home after her shift. She sat in her small apartment, the silence pressing down on her as she replayed the conversation with Wallace and Greaves in her mind. Greaves had made it clear. He wasn't going to let this go. Emily stared at her phone, wondering if she should call someone. Her grandmother, maybe, or a friend from her old hospital. But she didn't want to burden them with her worries. They wouldn't understand the pressure she was under, the way everything felt like it was closing in on her. Instead, she found herself scrolling through the news on her phone, looking for something, anything, that might distract her. But as she scrolled, her heart skipped a beat when she stumbled upon an article that mentioned Mercy Hills General. It was a brief piece, a local news story about a hospital investigation. The details were vague, but it mentioned that several complaints had been filed regarding patient safety and staff treatment. The article hinted at problems with faulty equipment, understaffing, and negligence, all things Emily had seen firsthand. Her mind raced. Was this what Dr. Patel and Dr. Ross had been talking about? Was the administration trying to cover up more than just faulty equipment? And why hadn't anyone said anything? Suddenly, everything started to fall into place. The whispers, the tension, the way people like Greaves and Kelly were so determined to maintain control. They were protecting something much bigger than Emily had realized. Her pulse quickened as a new thought crossed her mind. She wasn't just standing up to a bully. She was standing up to a system that was designed to protect itself at the expense of everyone else. And now that she had challenged it, there was no going back. The next morning, Emily arrived at the hospital with a renewed sense of determination. The weight of the previous day still hung over her, but now there was something else driving her forward. The cracks in the system were deeper than she had thought, and if she didn't act, they would only get worse. As she moved through her rounds, she noticed something different in the way her colleagues interacted with her. Some, like Anna, gave her encouraging smiles as if they admired what she had done. Others, like Kelly, avoided eye contact altogether, as though they didn't want to be associated with her. It was clear that word had spread. By mid-morning, Emily found herself once again standing outside Michael Archer's room. She hadn't seen him since their conversation in the staff lounge, but she needed to talk to him now. She needed to know more about what was happening, about what she had just stepped into. When she entered the room, Archer looked up from his tablet, his expression calm but curious. "Nurse Lawson," he greeted her, a faint smile on his lips. "I was wondering when you'd stop by." Emily crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside his bed. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You were right," she said quietly. "There's something wrong with this place, more than I realized." Archer's smile widened slightly, but his eyes were serious. "I know." Emily leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's an investigation, isn't there? Into the hospital?" Archer didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something like confirmation. "You're starting to see it," he said finally, his tone low. "The cracks in the system. And now that you've spoken up, you've become a threat." Emily's stomach tightened. "What do I do?" Archer studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You keep doing what you're doing. You keep speaking the truth. But be careful, Nurse Lawson. They'll come after you now. And if you're not careful, they'll take everything from you." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had known the risks when she confronted Greaves, but now the full weight of what she was up against was starting to sink in. The system wasn't just flawed, it was corrupt, and she had just put herself right in the middle of it. But despite the fear that gnawed at her, Emily knew she couldn't back down. She had come too far, and now that she had started this fight, she had to see it through, no matter what it cost her. The days following Emily's confrontation with Dr. Greaves felt like walking through a minefield. Every step she took at Mercy Hills General Hospital seemed to carry the weight of impending doom. The tension, which had always simmered just beneath the surface, was now palpable in every corner of the hospital. Conversations would stop abruptly when Emily entered a room, and the once subtle glances from her colleagues had turned into open stares of curiosity, concern, and, in some cases, contempt. Emily had become the subject of the hospital's rumor mill, a mixture of admiration from those who saw her as brave and resentment from others who felt she had stirred the pot too much. But as each day passed, it became clearer that her stand against Greaves had done more than just ruffle feathers. It had exposed fault lines in the hospital that no one had been prepared to confront. But Emily wasn't just dealing with the fallout inside the hospital. Her nights had become sleepless, her mind racing with thoughts of the investigation, the mounting threats from Greaves, and the cryptic warnings from Michael Archer. She couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was looming on the horizon, something that could break her or push her further than she had ever thought possible. Emily's shift had barely begun when she was called into Joan Wallace's office once again. This time, Wallace wasn't alone. Dr. Greaves sat across from the head nurse, his face as unreadable as ever, though his cold eyes were fixed on Emily as she entered the room. Wallace's expression was tight, her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. "Sit down, Nurse Lawson," Wallace said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. Emily sat, her stomach knotting with anticipation. She had expected more consequences after her confrontation with Greaves, but the presence of both of them in the same room felt more ominous than she had anticipated. "We've been discussing your conduct over the past few days," Wallace began, her tone neutral but firm. "It seems there's been some concern about the way you've handled certain situations." Emily fought to keep her face calm, though her heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was coming. "I haven't handled anything outside of my professional duties," Emily said carefully, her voice steady. "I've advocated for my patients and my colleagues, and I've raised concerns when I felt there were issues that needed to be addressed." Dr. Greaves's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "You've raised more than concerns, Nurse Lawson. You've disrupted the chain of command. You've made accusations without evidence. This hospital runs on discipline and order, not personal crusades." Emily's hands tightened into fists in her lap. "I've only spoken the truth, and the issues I've raised about the equipment, about patient safety, are real. Ignoring them isn't an option anymore." Wallace cleared her throat, her eyes darting between Emily and Greaves, as if she were trying to keep the situation from spiraling further. "We understand that you're passionate, Nurse Lawson, but there are ways to address these matters without causing disruption." "Disruption?" Emily repeated, incredulous. Dr. Greaves humiliated and blamed a nurse for an issue that wasn't her fault, and the administration has ignored serious safety concerns for weeks. How am I supposed to address that quietly? Wallace sighed, rubbing her temples as if she were tired of the whole situation. "Nurse Lawson, I want to give you the benefit of the doubt here, but this hospital doesn't thrive on disorder. If you continue down this path, it may have consequences beyond your control." The veiled threat hung in the air, but Emily didn't flinch. She had expected this, and as much as it terrified her, she couldn't back down now. "Is that a warning?" Emily asked, her voice low. Greaves leaned forward, his cold eyes locked on hers. "It's a reality check, Nurse Lawson. You think you can take on this system, but you're just one person. Mercy Hills doesn't change because someone like you decides to make noise." Something inside Emily snapped at those words. "Someone like me?" she repeated, her voice sharp. Greaves's smile widened, cruel and condescending. "Yes, someone like you. Someone who doesn't understand how things work. Someone who's in over her head." Emily's pulse quickened with fury, but she refused to let Greaves see how much his words stung. She had heard those words before, words designed to remind her of her place, to make her feel small, powerless. But she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. "I understand exactly how things work, Dr. Greaves," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "I understand that people like you have been running this place unchecked for too long, and I understand that your arrogance is putting patients at risk." The room fell silent. Even Wallace seemed taken aback by Emily's boldness. But Greaves's expression darkened, his smile fading as he stood abruptly. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. "This isn't over." With that, Greaves turned and stormed out of the office, leaving Wallace and Emily in tense silence. Wallace looked at Emily with a mixture of frustration and something else, something that almost looked like respect. "You've made things difficult for yourself, Nurse Lawson. I know, Emily said quietly, her heart still racing. Wallace sighed again, leaning back in her chair. I'm not here to protect Greaves, and I know you're right about some of the issues you've raised. But this hospital is more complicated than you think. There are forces at work here that go beyond patient care. Emily frowned, leaning forward slightly. What do you mean? Wallace hesitated, as though weighing whether to say more. I can't explain everything, but you've stepped into something that's bigger than just faulty equipment or a toxic work environment. Be careful, Nurse Lawson. You're not just dealing with one man's ego. There are deeper interests at play here. Emily's mind raced with questions, but Wallace stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Just think carefully before you make your next move. Emily left the office, her thoughts swirling. Deeper interests? What was Wallace talking about? She had always known that Mercy Hills had its share of problems, but she hadn't realized how deep those problems ran. And now, it seemed that the more she pushed, the more dangerous things became. Later that afternoon, Emily found herself back in Michael Archer's room. She hadn't meant to seek him out again so soon, but after her conversation with Wallace, she needed answers. Answers that she felt Archer might have. When she entered the room, Archer was sitting up in bed, looking over some documents on his tablet. He glanced up when she walked in, his expression as calm and collected as ever. Nurse Lawson, he greeted her, his voice smooth. Back so soon? Emily didn't bother with pleasantries this time. I need to know what's really going on here. Archer raised an eyebrow, setting his tablet aside. You're starting to see the cracks, aren't you? Emily crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside his bed. It's more than cracks. Wallace said there are deeper interests at play. What does that mean? Archer's smile faded and his expression grew serious. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. Mercy Hills isn't just a hospital, it's part of a network that prioritizes profit over care, power over people, and that network has deep roots. Emily's heart raced. What kind of network? Private investors, corporate interests, government ties. It's all connected, Archer explained. Hospitals like this don't just run on patient fees. They run on deals made behind closed doors, deals that have nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with money and influence. Emily stared at him, her mind spinning. And Greaves? Greaves is part of that system, Archer said, his voice lowering. He's not just a doctor, he's a gatekeeper. He makes sure that people like you don't disrupt the flow of things. That's why he's coming after you. You've become a threat to his power, and he's not going to let that go. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had known she was up against something larger than just one man, but this was bigger than she had imagined. But why are you telling me this? Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Why are you helping me? Archer smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. Because I've seen what happens when people like you get silenced. I've seen good people get pushed out, get destroyed, because they tried to stand up for what's right. I've been part of that system, and I know how it works. But I'm not going to let it happen again, not to you. Emily's chest tightened with emotion. She had never expected to find an ally in someone like Archer, someone who had seen the system from the inside and was willing to help her fight it. But as much as his words gave her hope, they also filled her with fear. What do I do now? She asked quietly. You keep going, Archer said simply. But you'll need allies, people inside the hospital who believe in what you're doing. You can't take this on alone. Emily nodded, though the thought of finding allies in a place like Mercy Hills seemed daunting. Most of the staff were either too afraid to speak out or too loyal to the system that protected them. But she had to try. As she stood to leave, Archer spoke again, his voice softer now. Be careful, Emily. They'll come after you with everything they've got. But you're stronger than you think. Don't let them break you. Emily left the room, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The stakes were higher than she had realized, and the forces against her were more powerful than she had imagined. But she wasn't going to back down. As she walked through the quiet hallways of Mercy Hills, Emily thought about her past, about the challenges she had faced to get here, the racism she had endured, the countless times she had been told she didn't belong. Those experiences had shaped her, had made her stronger, and now, They would fuel her fight. She had made a choice the moment she stood up to Greaves. Now there was no turning back. Emily woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in her chest. The weight of what she was up against at Mercy Hills General loomed larger with every passing day. Now, it wasn't just about standing up to one man. It was about exposing a network of corruption and neglect that ran deep through the hospital's administration. She had been warned. Both Joan Wallace and Michael Archer had made it clear that this was a fight she couldn't take on alone. But finding allies in a place where silence was the norm and fear was a constant companion was easier said than done. She needed to tread carefully. The hospital was already bustling by the time Emily arrived for her shift. As she made her way through the busy corridors, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her. Every conversation seemed to stop when she approached, and every glance in her direction felt loaded with judgment, or worse, suspicion. She wasn't paranoid. She knew the rumors were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before the administration made its next move against her. But she wasn't going to wait for that to happen. She needed to start building a foundation of support. People she could trust. People who understood what was at stake. Her first thought was Anna, the young nurse she had stood up for during her confrontation with Dr. Greaves. Anna had been grateful, but more importantly, she had seen firsthand how the hospital's toxic culture affected its staff. Emily was sure that Anna, if given the chance, would be willing to stand with her. But she needed to be careful not to put too much pressure on someone who was already struggling under the weight of Mercy Hill's hierarchy. As Emily finished her rounds in the surgical recovery wing, she spotted Anna at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts. She approached slowly, making sure to appear casual as she walked up to her. "Hey, Anna," Emily said, keeping her voice light. "How's it going today?" Anna looked up, a flicker of relief crossing her face when she saw Emily. "Oh, hey, Emily. It's been busy." She glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one was listening. "Yesterday was rough." Emily nodded, understanding. "I know. I've been thinking about what happened." Anna's expression tightened, her gaze darting around the room again. I don't want to cause any trouble," she said quietly. "What you did, it was brave, but I can't afford to lose this job. You know how it is." Emily's heart sank. She had hoped Anna might be willing to speak up with her, but she could see the fear in the younger nurse's eyes. Anna was scared of the same thing Emily had been afraid of when she first started at Mercy Hills, being pushed out, being silenced. "I understand," Emily said gently. "I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but if anything happens, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Anna looked at her, gratitude and anxiety mixing in her eyes. "Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that." They exchanged a few more words before Emily moved on, her heart heavy with the realization that she couldn't rely on Anna just yet. She understood all too well how the fear of losing everything could silence people, even those who knew the truth. The system was designed to keep people like Anna in line, too scared to challenge the status quo. But Emily needed to find someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who was willing to risk everything for what was right. As the day wore on, Emily continued her rounds, keeping her head down but her mind racing with thoughts of how to find the allies she needed. The hostility in the air was growing stronger. She could feel it in the way her colleagues avoided eye contact with her, in the way even Kelly Thompson, who had once relished taunting her, now seemed to keep her distance, as though afraid of getting too close to the storm Emily had unleashed. By mid-afternoon, Emily had nearly finished her shift when she was called to assist with a patient in the ICU. The unit was always a high-pressure environment, but today there was an added layer of tension. As Emily entered the ICU, she noticed the strained expressions on the faces of the nurses and doctors working there. Something was off. Emily approached the nurse in charge, Maria Alvarez, who had always been professional but distant. Maria was a seasoned nurse in her 40s, with a reputation for being tough but fair. She had seen it all at Mercy Hills, and while she didn't engage in gossip, she was known for speaking her mind when it mattered. "Emily, you're here to assist with Mr. Darnell's case," Maria said, barely glancing up from the monitor as she spoke. "We're running into some complications." Emily nodded, immediately switching into work mode as she prepared to assist. As she worked alongside Maria, adjusting the patient's IV and monitoring his vitals, she could sense that Maria was holding something back. There was a tension in the air, and it wasn't just because of the patient's condition. When the situation was under control, Maria finally looked at Emily, her expression unreadable. "I heard about what happened with Greaves," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that no one else in the ICU could hear. Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression calm. "Yeah, I guess word's getting around," Maria nodded, her gaze sharp. "You need to be careful, Emily. Greaves isn't someone who forgives easily. He's going to come after you, and he's got the administration on his side." Emily swallowed, her pulse quickening. "I know, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. There's too much at stake." Maria studied her for a long moment before finally speaking again. "You're right, this place has been broken for a long time, and it's going to take more than one person to fix it." Emily looked at Maria, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "So you see it too?" Maria sighed, her eyes darkening. "I've been here a long time. I've seen nurses pushed out for less than what you did. I've seen doctors cover up mistakes, administrators sweep things under the rug, and people like Greaves run the show with no accountability. But most people here, nurses especially, are too afraid to fight back. We've all got families to feed, bills to pay. No one wants to be the one to risk it all." Emily's chest tightened. "But someone has to. If we don't, this place will never change." Maria's gaze softened just slightly, and for the first time, Emily saw something in her eyes that she hadn't seen before. Respect. "You're brave, Emily. Braver than most. But you're also in over your head. Greaves has connections, and the people running this hospital don't care about right or wrong. They care about keeping the money flowing and the reputation intact." "I'm not doing this alone," Emily said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "There are others, people who see what's happening and want to change it." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. "People like you." Maria's eyes flashed with something unreadable, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced around the ICU, making sure no one else was listening before leaning in closer to Emily. "You're going to need more than just good intentions to survive this," Maria said quietly. "If you're serious about taking on the administration, you're going to need evidence, something concrete that they can't ignore." Emily's heart raced. "Evidence of what?" Maria's gaze was steady. "Everything. Of everything. The faulty equipment, the cover-ups, the way they've pushed people out. If you can get that, maybe, just maybe, you'll stand a chance." Emily's mind whirled. She had suspected that there was more going on at Mercy Hills than just negligence and ego, but now it was becoming clear that the corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. And if she was going to take on the system, she would need to prove it. "But how do I get that evidence?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria hesitated, her expression guarded. "There are files, records that the administration doesn't want anyone to see. But getting to them won't be easy. They keep everything locked down tight. You'll need someone on the inside, someone with access." Emily's heart pounded. "Do you know anyone who can help?" Maria's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Emily. "I know a few people who might be willing to take a risk, but if you go down this road, there's no turning back. You'll be putting everything on the line." Emily didn't hesitate. "I'm already in too deep. I can't walk away now." Maria studied her for a moment longer before finally nodding. "All right, I'll see what I can do. But be careful, Emily. You're playing with fire." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, but Emily's mind was racing with thoughts of what Maria had said. Evidence. Concrete proof of the corruption at Mercy Hills. It was a daunting task, but it was also exactly what she needed to bring the system down. By the time her shift ended, Emily was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally. But despite her exhaustion, there was a spark of determination burning inside her. For the first time since her confrontation with Greaves, she felt like she had a plan, a way forward. As she walked out of the hospital that evening, the cool night air hit her skin, and she took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. The battle ahead was going to be long and difficult, but she wasn't alone anymore. Maria was willing to help, and maybe, just maybe, there were others too. But as Emily approached the bus stop, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Parked just across the street, half hidden in the shadows, was a sleek black car. The same car she had seen before, Dr. Greaves's car. Her heart skipped a beat as the car's headlights flicked on, illuminating her in the fading light of the evening. For a moment the car just sat there, idling, watching. And then, without warning, it sped away into the night. Emily stood frozen, her pulse racing with a mixture of fear and anger. Greaves wasn't just coming after her professionally. He was trying to intimidate her, to scare her into backing down. But as the car disappeared from view, Emily's resolve only strengthened. He could watch her, he could try to scare her, but she wasn't going to stop. The fight had only just begun. The next few days at Mercy Hills General Hospital felt like walking a tightrope for Emily. With each step, each interaction, she knew she was edging closer to something dangerous. Something that could not only destroy her career, but put her at personal risk. After seeing Dr. Greaves's car watching her that night, she had been hyper-aware of every move she made inside and outside the hospital. The sense of being followed, of unseen forces gathering against her, gnawed at her constantly. But that fear was nothing compared to the fire burning inside her. She had made her decision. She had found an ally in Maria Alvarez, and together they were going to expose the truth about the corruption festering at Mercy Hills. There was no turning back. The stakes were rising. On a late Thursday afternoon, Emily found herself in the small break room on the third floor, waiting for Maria. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty corridors of the hospital. The usual bustle of nurses and doctors had quieted as the shift changed, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Maria had told Emily to meet her after her shift for something important, something that could change everything. When the door finally opened, Maria slipped inside, glancing around quickly before closing it behind her. Her face was tense, her eyes sharper than usual. "Did anyone see you come in?" Maria asked quietly, as if someone might be listening from the shadows. Emily shook her head. "No. What's going on?" Maria sat down, pulling out a folder from beneath her coat and sliding it across the table toward Emily. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. "These are records I've been keeping for the past year, notes on patient complaints, equipment failures, staff turnover. I've seen nurses get pushed out quietly when they've tried to raise concerns. I've seen patients leave this hospital with complications that could have been avoided." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Inside were handwritten notes, patient files, and internal memos, documents that clearly showed a pattern of negligence. Each page was a small piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that revealed how Mercy Hills had been sacrificing patient care for profit, all while covering up its failures. It's a start," Emily whispered, her heart racing. "But we need more. We need something concrete that links this directly to the administration." Maria nodded, her expression grim. "I know. That's why I'm giving you this now. I can only get so close without raising suspicions, but I know there's more, deep in the administrative files. Payrolls, contracts with suppliers, maintenance reports that have been buried. If we can get our hands on those, it'll be enough to bring the whole system down." Emily's pulse quickened. "But how do we get that? The files are locked down, and we don't have access." Maria hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's someone who might be able to help. He works in IT, and I've heard rumors that he's not happy with the way things are being run. He might be willing to take a risk if he believes in the cause." Emily's eyes widened. "Do you think he'll trust us?" Maria gave a small, tight smile. "I don't know, but it's our best shot." Emily's mind raced. The idea of involving someone else in their plans was risky, dangerous, even, but it was also the only way forward. If they wanted to bring down Mercy Hills, they needed that evidence, and they couldn't do it alone. "Do you think you can get us a meeting with him?" Emily asked, her voice filled with urgency. Maria nodded. "I'll reach out to him tonight. But you need to be careful, Emily. Greaves and the administration are already watching you closely. If they catch wind of what we're doing—" "I know," Emily said quietly, "but we have to keep going. We can't stop now." Maria looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "You're braver than most people I know, but bravery only takes you so far. Be smart about this. Emily nodded, closing the folder and slipping it into her bag. The weight of what they were doing pressed heavily on her chest, but there was no other option. The system at Mercy Hills was corrupt to its core, and if they didn't expose it, more patients and staff would suffer. As Maria stood to leave, she hesitated, her hand on the door. "One more thing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful at home, too. I've heard things whispers. Greaves has friends in high places, and they're not above getting personal." Emily's stomach twisted, but she kept her face calm. "I will." Maria gave her a final nod before slipping out the door and disappearing into the shadows of the hospital's empty corridors. That night, Emily returned home feeling the weight of everything Maria had said. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was always just out of sight, tracking her every move. She had been careful since that night she saw Greaves's car, but Maria's warning about things getting personal sent a chill down her spine. Emily locked her apartment door behind her and double-checked the windows. She wasn't normally the type to get paranoid, but this was different. This wasn't just professional rivalry anymore. This was a fight against a system that would do anything to protect itself. And the more she uncovered, the more dangerous things became. As she sat at her kitchen table, the folder Maria had given her spread out in front of her, Emily's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maria. "Got us a meeting. Tomorrow night, parking garage at 9 p.m. Be careful." Emily's heart raced. Tomorrow. Everything was moving so fast, but it had to. The hospital's administration wasn't going to wait for her to make her move. They were already trying to crush her. If she didn't act now, she might never get another chance. The following day at Mercy Hills was tense, more so than usual. Emily went about her rounds with the same quiet efficiency she always did. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around her was watching, waiting. Every glance from a fellow nurse, every passing interaction with a doctor, felt loaded with unspoken suspicion. Even Kelly Thompson, who had spent so much time undermining her, seemed unusually quiet, her eyes darting nervously whenever Emily entered the room. The air was thick with tension, and Emily knew why. Word was spreading. Greaves's influence was tightening its grip, and the hospital staff were sensing the shift in the air. But Emily wasn't backing down. Not now. It wasn't until her shift ended that the real tension began to set in. She had been on edge all day, anticipating what was to come, and now that the meeting with Maria's IT contact was only a few hours away, her nerves were starting to fray. She kept telling herself that this was what needed to happen, that they couldn't stop now, but the weight of it all pressed heavily on her. As the clock neared 9 p.m., Emily found herself standing in the shadowy parking garage beneath Mercy Hills, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold, sterile light from the street lamps cast long shadows across the concrete, making the space feel even more isolated. Every sound, every echo of footsteps, every distant car horn felt amplified in the stillness. Maria arrived first, stepping out of the stairwell with her coat pulled tight around her. Her eyes darted around the garage before she spotted Emily and quickly made her way over. "Are you ready?" Maria asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I am." A few moments later, a figure emerged from the shadows of the garage. A young man, no older than his mid-30s, with dark hair and glasses. He looked nervous, his eyes shifting as he approached them, as though he were constantly checking for anyone who might be watching. "This is Eric," Maria said, introducing him. "He works in IT." Emily extended her hand, but Eric barely glanced at her before giving a quick nod. "I don't have much time. I'm risking my job just by being here." "We understand," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Eric hesitated, glancing around the garage again before finally speaking. "I've been watching things for a while now, quietly. I've seen the files they try to hide, the ones they think no one can access. They've been covering up patient complaints, medical errors, faulty equipment, everything." Emily's pulse quickened. "Do you have access to those files?" Eric nodded. "I do, but getting them out won't be easy. If anyone finds out I've been in there, I'll be fired. Or worse." Maria stepped forward. "We're not asking you to risk everything for nothing. If you help us get those files, we can blow this wide open." We can expose them for what they've done. Eric looked at Maria, then at Emily, weighing his options. His hands were shaking slightly, and Emily could tell he was terrified. But she also saw something else in his eyes. Something like determination. "I'll do it," Eric said finally. "But we have to be careful. If they find out, we're all finished." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you. We'll be careful." Eric glanced around one last time before slipping a small flash drive into Maria's hand. "I've already pulled some of the files. These should get you started. But there's more. Way more. I'll get the rest as soon as I can." Maria nodded, slipping the drive into her pocket. "We'll make sure this gets out." Eric gave them a final nod before turning and disappearing into the shadows of the parking garage, leaving Emily and Maria standing in the eerie silence. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they made their way out of the garage and back into the cold night air. They had the evidence. The pieces were starting to come together, but the danger was only growing. And as they walked through the darkened streets, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that unseen forces were still watching, waiting to strike. The battle was far from over. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and secrecy. After their clandestine meeting with Eric, the IT specialist, Emily and Maria found themselves in possession of something dangerous. Proof. The flash drive that now sat hidden in Maria's possession contained files, records, and evidence of everything they suspected. Patient complaints that had been buried, equipment failures ignored, and medical errors swept under the rug. They finally had what they needed to expose the corruption festering within Mercy Hills General. But having the evidence was only the first step. The question now was, what would they do with it? Every day that passed made Emily more and more aware of the risks they were taking. Dr. Greaves wasn't just watching her, he was waiting. His presence loomed large over every shift, every interaction, like a shadow that grew darker and more oppressive with each passing day. Emily could feel his influence tightening around her, the weight of his threats heavier now that she had dared to defy him so openly. The hospital, once a place of routine and purpose, now felt suffocating. Emily sat in the break room late one evening, her eyes scanning over patient charts, though her mind was far from focused. Maria had taken the flash drive home with her, promising to go through the files and figure out the best way to bring them to light. But Emily's anxiety only grew with the passing hours. She trusted Maria, but the more time that passed, the more it felt like they were playing with fire. Every day she walked into Mercy Hills, Emily felt as if she were walking into enemy territory. The walls were closing in, and she wasn't sure how long she could hold out before something, or someone, broke. The door to the break room creaked open, and Emily's heart skipped a beat as Kelly Thompson walked in. The familiar tension between them hung in the air, though today Kelly seemed more subdued than usual. Kelly glanced at Emily, her eyes flickering with something unspoken before she turned to grab a coffee. Emily tried to ignore her, focusing on her notes, but after a few moments, Kelly spoke. "You've been quiet lately," Kelly said, her voice oddly neutral. Emily glanced up, surprised by the shift in Kelly's tone. There was none of the usual condescension, none of the smug superiority she had come to expect. Instead, Kelly seemed uncertain. "Just busy," Emily replied cautiously, unsure of where the conversation was headed. Kelly leaned against the counter, staring down into her coffee cup. For a moment she said nothing, and Emily thought she might leave. But then Kelly spoke again, her voice lower this time. "I heard, things are getting tense around here," Kelly said, her words careful, as if she were testing the waters. "People are talking." Emily's pulse quickened. "People are always talking." Kelly let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, but this feels different. There's something happening, something big, and I'm not sure I want to be caught in the middle of it." Emily studied Kelly, her mind racing. Was Kelly trying to warn her, or was this some kind of trap? Trusting Kelly had never been an option, but something about her demeanor today felt off, like she was just as scared as everyone else. "What do you know, Kelly?" Emily asked, her voice steady but probing. Kelly looked up, her eyes flickering with unease. "I know that Greaves is watching you. He's watching everyone, but you're his target now, and the administration, they're not going to let this slide. If you don't back off, they'll come after you, hard." Emily's heart pounded. but she kept her face composed. What do you care? Kelly hesitated, her gaze shifting to the door as if she expected someone to walk in. I don't, she said finally, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. But this place is a mess, and I'm not stupid. I don't want to get dragged down with it. Emily leaned back, watching Kelly carefully. She could feel the cracks forming around her, the tension building toward something inevitable. Kelly was scared of what was coming, and that fear made her dangerous. But it also made her a potential ally. You don't have to, Emily said quietly, her voice softer now. You could help us. Kelly's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise. Help you with what? We have proof, Kelly, Emily said, her heart racing. Real proof of what's been happening here. The negligence, the cover-ups. We can take it to the authorities, to the press. We can expose all of it. For a moment, Kelly just stared at her as if weighing her options. Her eyes darted back and forth between Emily and the door, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. That's risky, Kelly said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. If they find out you're planning to do that. They won't, Emily said firmly. Not if we're careful, but we can't do it alone. We need people on the inside. People who can help us get the rest of the evidence. Kelly was silent, her eyes flickering with indecision. Emily could see the fear warring with something else. Something like hope. Kelly had always been a part of the system, but even she must have realized by now that the system was crumbling. If I help you, Kelly said slowly, her voice shaking slightly, what's in it for me? Emily didn't hesitate. You get to walk away clean, you help us, and when this all comes crashing down, you're not on the wrong side. Kelly swallowed hard, her eyes searching Emily's face for a long moment. Finally, she gave a small nod. I'll think about it. And with that, Kelly turned and walked out of the break room, leaving Emily sitting alone with her thoughts racing. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Kelly had never been an ally before, but if she could be convinced to help, it would change everything. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The weight of what they were doing pressed down on her, making it impossible to relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the street outside her apartment felt like a warning. She kept replaying Kelly's words in her mind. They're watching you. They'll come after you. But Emily couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached for it, half expecting it to be from Maria or even Kelly. But when she looked at the screen, her blood ran cold. It was an unknown number, and the message was short. We know what you're doing. Stop now, or you'll regret it. Emily sat up, her heart racing. The text felt like a knife twisting in her gut. It was a clear threat, and there was no question about who had sent it. Greaves. The administration. Someone who wanted her to stop, someone who knew they were close to uncovering the truth. She stared at the message, her hands trembling. Fear coursed through her veins, but beneath that fear was something else. Anger. They were trying to intimidate her, to scare her into backing down. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. With shaking fingers, Emily deleted the message and set her phone back down on the nightstand. She couldn't let them get to her. She couldn't afford to let fear win. But she knew now, without a doubt, that they were watching. The hospital, the administration, Greaves. They were closing in, and the storm she had started was growing larger, more dangerous. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going without breaking, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to stop. The next day at Mercy Hills felt different, like the calm before a storm. Emily moved through the hospital with her usual quiet efficiency, but now she was hyper-aware of every glance, every conversation that stopped when she walked by. The weight of the text message still lingered in her mind, but she couldn't let it show. She had to act as if everything was normal, as if nothing had changed. But she knew everything had changed. During her lunch break, she met Maria in one of the hospital's smaller, less frequented staff lounges. The tension in the air was palpable, and Maria's expression was grim as she slid the flash drive across the table toward Emily. I went through the files, Maria said quietly, her voice tense. There's enough here to start something big, but we're missing one key piece: financial records. If we can get those, we'll have the proof we need to show that the administration has been profiting off this negligence. Without that, it'll be harder to make the charges stick. Emily nodded, her mind racing. How do we get those? Maria hesitated, glancing around the room before speaking again. Eric might be able to help, but it's risky. The financial records are locked down tight, and if he gets caught, we'll figure it out, Emily said firmly, though the fear of what they were doing weighed heavily on her. Maria gave her a tight smile. We're running out of time, Emily. Greaves is on to us. You need to be prepared for things to get ugly. Emily's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. I know. I got a message last night. Maria's eyes widened. What kind of message? Emily pulled out her phone, showing Maria the text she had received. Maria's face darkened as she read it, her lips pressing into a thin line. They're trying to scare you, Maria said, her voice filled with quiet anger. But that means we're getting close. They wouldn't be threatening you if we weren't. Emily nodded, though the fear still gnawed at her. I'm not going to back down. Maria placed a hand on Emily's arm, her eyes filled with determination. Neither am I. That evening, Emily found herself sitting on a bench outside Mercy Hills, watching the sun set over the city skyline. The hospital loomed behind her, a massive structure that had once seemed like a beacon of care and healing. But now it felt like something darker, something corrupt, filled with secrets and lies. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of red and orange, Emily's phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was from Maria. Eric's in? Meet me tomorrow. We're getting those records. Emily stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm was gathering, and they were about to walk straight into the heart of it. But this time they weren't going in blind. This time, they had proof. The next evening, the tension in the air was palpable. Emily stood just outside the entrance to the parking garage, her breath coming in slow, steady waves as she tried to calm the racing of her heart. The city lights shimmered in the distance, casting long shadows across the streets, but inside the hospital, a storm was brewing, and Emily was about to walk straight into the eye of it. Maria had sent a message earlier that day. It's happening tonight. Eric's got the access. Tonight was the night everything would either come together or fall apart. The plan was simple but dangerous. Eric had agreed to pull the financial records from the hospital servers, the final piece of evidence they needed to bring down the administration and expose the negligence and corruption running rampant through Mercy Hills. The files would show how patient safety had been compromised for profit, how lives had been put at risk for the sake of the hospital's bottom line. But they had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. Dr. Greaves and the hospital's administration were watching, waiting for any sign that Emily and Maria were onto them. They wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened their power. Emily glanced at her phone, her nerves humming with anticipation. She was supposed to meet Maria and Eric in the hospital's IT room in 20 minutes, after most of the staff had cleared out for the night shift. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, but she pushed the fear down. There was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the parking garage, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Inside Mercy Hills, the hospital felt strangely quiet, the usual bustle of activity reduced to a dull hum. The hallways were mostly empty, save for the occasional nurse or doctor passing by, their faces weary after long shifts. Emily made her way to the basement, where the IT department was located, her pulse quickening with every step. When she reached the door to the IT room, she paused, taking one last deep breath before knocking. The door creaked open, and Maria peeked out, her face tense but determined. She motioned for Emily to enter quickly, and as soon as she stepped inside, the door closed behind her. Eric's already in the system, Maria whispered, leading Emily to the far corner of the room, where Eric sat hunched over a computer, typing rapidly. The dim glow of the screen illuminated his face, which was tight with concentration. Eric glanced up briefly when Emily approached. I'm almost in, he said, his voice low but urgent. The files are buried deep, but I found a back door into the admin servers. We're pulling everything we need. Emily's heart raced. This was it. They were so close. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft clicking of keys as Eric worked. Emily and Maria stood behind him, their nerves on edge as they waited for the files to download. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of what they were doing pressing heavily on Emily's chest. Finally, Eric leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath of relief. "Got it," he said, holding up a small flash drive. "All the financial records, the contracts with suppliers, the payoffs, everything." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she took the drive from him. This tiny device held the power to bring down Mercy Hills. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the proof they needed to expose the hospital's corruption to the world. But before they could celebrate, a sudden noise cut through the quiet room, a soft creak like the sound of a door opening. Emily's blood ran cold. Maria's eyes widened, and Eric froze in his chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. And then they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, approaching from the hallway outside. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she quickly pocketed the flash drive. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maria nodded, her face pale. "There's another exit down the hall." They moved quickly, slipping out of the IT room and into the dimly lit hallway. The footsteps had grown louder, closer, and Emily could feel the pulse of fear pounding in her veins. Whoever was coming wasn't far behind. They made it to the exit door just as the footsteps reached the corner. Emily glanced back over her shoulder, and for a brief, terrifying moment she saw him, Dr. Greaves. His cold, calculating eyes locked on hers as he stepped into the hallway, his expression a mixture of fury and triumph. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. But Emily didn't stop. She shoved the exit door open, and they burst out into the cool night air, running through the parking lot as fast as they could. Her lungs burned with exertion, but she didn't dare slow down. Greaves was behind them, and he wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything they had worked for. They made it to Maria's car, and without a word, Maria started the engine, speeding out of the parking lot and onto the empty city streets. Emily's hands were shaking as she clutched the flash drive in her pocket, her mind racing with adrenaline. "We did it," Eric whispered from the back seat, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "We actually got the files." Maria kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "But we're not safe yet. Greaves knows." Emily nodded, her pulse still racing. "We need to get this to the authorities. We need to make sure the press gets these files. Once it's out there, they won't be able to stop it." But even as she said the words, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Greaves wasn't going to let this go. He had been watching her for weeks, waiting for the moment to strike, and now that he knew what they had, he would do everything in his power to stop them. As Maria drove, Emily pulled out her phone and began drafting an email to an investigative journalist she had contacted days earlier. The journalist had agreed to meet with her if she had proof, real proof, and now she did. But just as she finished attaching the files, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Greaves. "You've made a mistake, Lawson. This won't end the way you think it will." Emily's hands shook as she stared at the message. She knew what it meant. Greaves was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. She quickly hit send on the email, her heart pounding as she watched the message disappear into the ether. It was done. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of tension and fear. Emily, Maria, and Eric stayed hidden, keeping to Maria's apartment while they waited for the story to break. Emily barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of what Greaves might do next. But no matter how scared she was, she knew they had done the right thing. The truth was out there now. And then, the next morning, it happened. Emily's phone buzzed with a series of notifications, texts, calls, emails. The investigative journalist had published the story, and it was spreading like wildfire. Headlines screamed across the screen. "Corruption exposed at Mercy Hills General Hospital. Patients at risk for profit." Internal documents reveal shocking negligence at prestigious hospital. The full story was out there. Everything from the buried complaints to the faulty equipment and the financial records that showed how the hospital had profited from cutting corners. The administration had been caught red-handed, and there was no hiding now. Emily's hands trembled as she scrolled through the article, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. But the danger wasn't over. Hours later, Emily received another call, this time from Joan Wallace, the head nurse. Wallace's voice was tight with tension, but there was something else there too. Respect. "They've suspended Greaves," Wallace said. "The administration is scrambling to contain this, but it's too late. People are resigning left and right. The authorities are getting involved." Emily's chest tightened with emotion. "What about the hospital?" "It's not going to be easy," Wallace admitted. "But thanks to you and Maria, we have a chance to rebuild, to make this place something it should have been all along." For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a flicker of hope. The battle had been long, brutal, and terrifying, but they had won. Greaves was gone, the administration was collapsing, and the hospital was on the verge of a transformation. As she hung up the phone, Emily let out a long, slow breath, her body finally relaxing after days of tension. She had risked everything, but it had been worth it. She had made a difference. The following weeks were filled with change. Dr. Greaves had been forced to resign in disgrace, and several members of the hospital's administration had been fired or arrested as the investigation into Mercy Hills deepened. The hospital was under new leadership now, and the toxic culture that had once plagued it was slowly beginning to shift. Emily, Maria, and Eric had all been hailed as heroes for their role in exposing the truth. But Emily didn't care about the accolades. What mattered was that the patients were safer now, the staff was treated with more respect, and the hospital was becoming the place of healing it had always claimed to be. As she stood outside the hospital one afternoon, watching the staff and patients come and go, Emily couldn't help but smile. The fight had been hard, harder than she had ever imagined, but it was over now. The storm had passed, and they had won.